It is 1806, you're 12 years old, and you're sitting very still. A steel rod runs the full length of your spine, leather straps fix it at your shoulders, your waist, and the base of your skull. You can't turn your head. The ache in your lower back has been building for an hour, but you've learned that moving only makes it worse. Across the room, 4 other girls sit in the same device. None of them are crying. They stopped doing that weeks ago. This isn't a prison, it's a school. Your parents are paying 40 guineas a year for this. Tonight, you're going to discover how an entire system in Regency England was built to shape girls into products for the marriage market. The word they used was accomplished. But behind the music lessons and the needlework and the perfect posture was something darker, something no advertisement ever mentioned. And it started the moment your parents signed the fee book. To understand what happened inside these schools, you have to understand why they existed. And the answer isn't education. Not really. Not in the way you'd recognise the word. In Regency England, roughly 1800 to 1830, a daughter's future was decided before she could walk. She was to marry. She was to marry well, and well had a very specific meaning. A husband with income, a family name, and social standing, someone whose position could lift your family higher, or at the very least hold it where it was. Your daughter's happiness came second. Her curiosity came second. The life she might have quietly imagined for herself came nowhere at all. That's not cynicism. That's the way the world was arranged. And from that arrangement a market emerged. Not one with posted prices and open stalls, but market all the same. The product was a young woman. The buyers were families with eligible sons. And the currency, the thing that set a girl's value in this polite exchange, was a specific set of performable, observable skills. They called them accomplishments. Not knowledge, not education, accomplishments. Things you could demonstrate in a drawing room while someone across from you quietly decided whether you were worth pursuing. Music was the most important. You were expected to play the pianoforte, and if your family could afford it, the harp. Not to concert standard, that would have raised his eyebrows. A woman who played too well risked looking professional, and professional was a category no respectable family wanted near its daughters. The standard was pleasant competence, enough to fill a room agreeably after dinner without drawing too much attention to your skill. The harp held particular favour, not just for its sound, but for the image it created. A girl at the harp sat upright, arms extended, fingers moving with visible grace. The instrument was a frame for the body, half music, half portrait, which, as strategies for attracting a husband go, was remarkably efficient. French came next, not fluency, not the ability to read Voltaire or hold a conversation about ideas, enough to pronounce a menu, to drop a phrase into polite talk, to signal that someone had invested in your Polish. French was social wallpaper. It dressed the room without doing anything structural. Then came needlework. And this is where the system reveals itself most clearly. Because needlework wasn't just a skill. It was a language. Not the practical kind. Not darning stockings or mending a coat. That was servants' work. This was fancy work. Embroidery, tambour lace, ornamental stitching designed to be framed, draped on tables, admired by visitors, never once used for anything functional. You'd sit in a drawing room with a hoop balanced in your lap, pulling a needle through white linen stitch after steady stitch. The light from the window would catch the thread as you drew it through, and the person watching, a guest, a suitor's mother, the suitor himself, would read your hands like a letter of recommendation. Patience, industry, domestic virtue, obedience, all communicated without a single word. Your needle spoke for you. Dancing, singing, drawing in watercolours, always flowers or landscapes, never anything with a strong opinion, and above all, deportment. The art of entering a room correctly, how to walk without appearing to hurry, how to sit without appearing to collapse, how to lower your eyes when a man spoke and raise them again at precisely the right moment. Every one of these skills served the same quiet function. They didn't teach you how to think. They taught you how to be watched. Before we go further, I just want to say hello. I'm glad you're here tonight. If you could have chosen one Regency accomplishment, music, dancing, French, needlework, which would you have picked? Drop it in the comments and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good moment. All right, settle back in, let's keep going. Now imagine the other end of all this. Before the drawing room, before the accomplishments, before the steel rod against your spine. Imagine the morning your parents decided to send you away. You might have been 7, you might have been 10 or 11. In many families, the decision was made before you were old enough to understand what a boarding school even was. Your mother might have cried privately. Your father probably didn't discuss it with you. What was there to discuss? This was an investment. You were the asset. A carriage arrived. Your trunk was loaded. Linen, a prayer book, whatever small personal item you were permitted to bring. And then you left. Sometimes for months, sometimes for years. The house you left behind carried on without you, your chair empty at the table, your room slowly given over to other uses. The journey itself was usually short, a day by carriage, sometimes 2. Your mother might have come with you. Or you might have travelled with a servant, or with another girl's family headed to the same school. When the carriage finally stopped and you stepped down, what you saw depended entirely on how much your parents were paying. If the school was well funded, you'd see a tall house on a decent street, a clean front step, a maid waiting at the door. If it wasn't, and many weren't, you'd see something smaller, a house that looked like any other on the lane, with curtains that didn't quite match, and a front garden that had seen better years. Either way, the door would open. You'd step into a hallway that smelled of beeswax and something cooked hours ago. The headmistress would greet you. She might have been warm. She might have been brisk. You couldn't tell yet. She'd show you the schoolroom, where a few girls already sat with books or needlework in their laps. She'd point you toward the dormitory, a room with narrow beds, a washstand, and a window overlooking the back garden. The sheets would be clean but thin, the mattress harder than the one you'd left at home. And then your mother, or the servant, or whoever had brought you would leave. The carriage would pull away. You'd stand in a room full of strangers, holding your Bible and your one small item, and you'd understand, possibly for the first time, that you were going to be here for a very long time. Nobody had asked whether you wanted this. Nobody had asked how you felt. You were here because your family loved you, in the particular way that families love daughters in Regency England, by investing in your future market value. And the school would immediately begin doing what it was built to do. On your first morning, you'd rise early. You'd wash in cold water from a basin. You'd dress yourself. No maid here, unless your parents paid extra for that too. You'd join the other girls for prayers, then breakfast, then the schoolroom. And by the end of that first day, you'd begin to sense what your parents' money was actually purchasing. The pianoforte in the corner might be slightly out of tune, The French mistress might speak with an English accent heavier than your own. The needlework instruction might amount to being handed a hoop and told to copy the girl next to you. But the deportment lessons would be real. The moral instruction would be constant, and the message, spoken and unspoken, in every correction and every rule, would be clear. You're here to be made into something. Hold still. And that first night, alone in a bed that wasn't yours, in a room full of girls you'd never met, you'd begin to understand the shape of what was ahead. The house creaked around you. The mattress smelled of starch and someone else's soap. Through the wall, or maybe from the next bed, you could hear a girl crying, quietly, because she'd already learned that crying aloud brought correction, not comfort. You didn't cry. Or maybe you did. Maybe you pressed your face into the pillow and let the tears come silently, feeling the thin sheet against your skin and the cold air on the back of your neck. Nobody came to check on you. Nobody would come. You were not at home anymore. You were at school. And school, in this world, meant learning to manage every feeling you had, until the feeling itself became irrelevant. That was the first lesson. Before the French, before the piano, before the needlework, before any of it. The first lesson was, what you feel doesn't matter here. What matters is what you show. But what did this actually cost? And who could afford it? A standard boarding school for girls in Regency, England, charged between 20 and 40 guineas per year. That was the base fee. It covered room, board, and the usual curriculum. Reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, history, basic grammar, and daily moral instruction. The foundation, the part that wouldn't impress anyone important. The accomplishments cost extra, every single one of them. Piano lessons from a visiting music master, separate fee. Dancing, separate fee. French with a specialist tutor, separate fee. Drawing, watercolours, Italian if the family was ambitious, each billed individually on top of the base. In most schools, the list of paid extras was longer than the list of included subjects. A single quarter of piano instruction might cost 2 guineas alone. Stack 4 or 5 accomplishments together, and a family could easily double the annual bill. Put that in perspective. 40 guineas in 1810 is roughly £5,000 today. Double it for the accomplishments, and you're looking at £10,000 a year to teach a girl how to sit at a pianoforte and embroider a cushion she'd never use. And here's the detail that changes the whole picture. These schools weren't for the wealthy, the aristocracy, the great families who owned the land and sat in Parliament. Almost never sent their daughters to boarding schools. They didn't need to. They hired governesses. A governess lived in the house, ate at the family table, and taught the girls privately under the parents' direct eye. That was the prestige option. That was what real wealth could buy. The boarding schools were for the layer below. And this is where your story begins, if you imagine yourself in that world. The daughters of successful tradesmen, country clergymen, prosperous farmers, solicitors, merchants, and minor gentry. Families with enough income to want something better, but not enough to simply have it. These were parents who were stretching, spending money they couldn't always spare, because they understood with sharp clarity what would happen if they didn't. A country clergyman earning £150 a year might spend 40 guineas, more than a quarter of his income, to send his daughter to one of these schools for needlework and French. That's not education. That's a wager. And the fear behind that wager was specific, and you could feel it in every parlour where a father sat doing the arithmetic in his head. A girl without accomplishments was a girl without options. She might find a husband, but he'd be from her own station or lower. No upward movement, no wider circle, no different life for the children who came after. And in a world where a woman couldn't own property in her own name, couldn't earn a professional income, and had no realistic path to independence, a good marriage wasn't a pleasant extra. It was everything. So parents paid, they signed the fee book and sent their daughters away. And the return on that investment came down to a single question. Could the girl pass? Could she sit at a piano without fumbling, speak a little French without a heavy accent, embroider with clean, even stitches, walk into a room full of people from a higher class and look, for one evening, as if she had always belonged? If she could, a suitor might not look too closely at her background. He might see refinement. He might see a wife. That was what the fees bought. Not knowledge, a performance. And if the performance fell apart, if the suitor's family made inquiries and discovered her father kept a shop, then the years away from home, the loneliness, the aching back, the letters where you pretended to be happy, all of it for nothing. You'd go home knowing exactly how to curtsy for a room that would never invite you in. But let's stay with the ones who did pass for a moment, because even success had a strange weight to it. Imagine you're that girl again. You're 15 now. You've been at school for 2 years. Your parents have written to say they'll collect you at the end of term, and there's something in the letter you recognise, even though it's never said directly. They're going to start looking for a match. You've spent those 2 years learning a piece by Clementi on the pianoforte. You can manage simple conversation in French as long as the other person speaks slowly. Your embroidery is neat, though not inspired. You walk into rooms correctly now. You can hold your hands still in your lap. You've been trained to make eye contact just long enough to seem open and look away just fast enough to seem modest. All of this is about to be tested, not in a formal examination. There won't be marks or a certificate. Your test will be a series of evenings, drawing rooms, dinners arranged by your mother, an aunt, a family friend. The young man will sit across from you and he'll watch, not your mind, not your ideas, your wrists as they move across the keys, the angle of your neck as you listen to him speak, the way you hold your teacup. From 30 minutes of this, 30 minutes of performance, he'll decide whether to pursue you further or move on to the next drawing room. That's your examination. And you don't get many chances to sit it. The thing nobody talks about is what this system did to the girls who lived through it. Not physically, we'll come to that, but emotionally. You'd spend years learning to perform a version of yourself that wasn't quite real. And then you'd walk into a room and hope the performance was convincing enough to earn you a future. If it worked, you'd spend the rest of your life maintaining the act. If it didn't, you'd carry the weight of having failed at something that was never fair. Some girls came home from school and married within a year. Their families called that success. But many didn't marry quickly. Some never married at all. And for those women, the arithmetic was quiet and devastating. The money their parents had stretched to find was gone. The years away from home were gone. The accomplishments they'd worked so hard to learn suddenly had no stage, no audience, no purpose. A woman without a husband and without independent means had very few paths. She could become a governess, teaching the same accomplishment she'd once learned in someone else's house, for someone else's daughter. She could live as a companion to an elderly relative, dependent on charity. Or she could stay in her father's house, growing older and quieter, filling a smaller and smaller role in the family's life. The word for her, and you need to hear how heavy this word was Spinster. It carried weight, Not just social weight, though it carried that too. The quiet, persistent sense that an unmarried woman had somehow failed at the one thing society had asked of her. It carried practical weight. A spinster in her father's house was tolerated, not celebrated. She helped with younger siblings. She assisted with household management. She accompanied her mother on visits. She occupied space without filling it. And when her father died, she'd discover, often for the first time, how fragile her position really was. The house would go to a brother, or a nephew, or a cousin. The income would shift. The spinster, and you can picture her because you know her from novels, from family stories, from the silence around certain aunts, who had lived there for 30 years, would suddenly be a guest in what had been her home. She'd need to find somewhere else, a room in a relative's house, a cottage at reduced rent. The accomplishments she'd learned at boarding school, the piano, the French, the needlework, would be of no use to her at all. This was the landscape. This was what the schools were preparing girls for, and what they were desperately trying to help them avoid. The stakes were not abstract. They were not philosophical. They were immediate, practical, and ruthless, and every family that signed a fee book understood them, even if nobody said the words aloud. The schools never mentioned any of this. They sold the dream. They let the families carry the risk. The schools understood all of this perfectly. Look at the advertisements they placed in newspapers. They didn't promise education. They promised transformation. The Mrs. Somebody beg leave to inform their friends and the public that they have opened a seminary for the instruction of a limited number of young ladies. That phrase, a limited number, appeared again and again. It whispered exclusivity. It implied personal attention. It told a worried parent that their daughter wouldn't be lost in a crowd. The word seminary was doing quiet work too. From the Latin seminarium, a seedbed, a place of cultivation, it sounded institutional, serious, trustworthy. In practice, a seminary was usually a rented house, a parlour that doubled as a schoolroom, a dining room that smelled of boiled mutton, a back garden where girls walked in supervised pairs after lunch. But the advertisements were masterful. They promised every attention to health, morals, and manners. They listed subjects like a catalogue, English grammar, writing, and arithmetic, together with the French language, music, drawing, and every variety of ornamental needlework. Prices were almost never printed. The standard line was terms may be known by application, because putting a price in a newspaper would have been vulgar, and vulgarity was the one accomplishment no school could afford to demonstrate. The walls of these houses were often damp. The rooms smelled of chalk dust, candle wax, and wool drying near a fire. In winter, the cold crept into the floorboards and didn't leave until spring. But the advertisement mentioned none of that. It mentioned the pleasant situation of the house, the moral and intellectual development of its pupils. It painted a picture a worried mother could believe. And that raises the question that follows naturally from everything you've just heard. If these schools were private businesses, run from rented houses, with no inspections, no required qualifications, and no one ever checking whether those advertisements told the truth, then who, exactly, was running them? The answer, in most cases, was a woman who needed the money. That's not a judgment. It's the documented reality. In Regency England, a woman without a husband had almost no respectable way to support herself. She couldn't practice law or medicine. She couldn't hold public office. She couldn't run a business with the same legal authority a man could. But she could teach, or more precisely, she could claim to teach. And in a world with no licensing, no inspections, and no accountability, the claim was enough. because there were no requirements. None at all. No teaching certificates existed. No qualifying examinations. No licensing board. No government inspector would ever knock on your door. No law required a schoolmistress to demonstrate competence in the subject she advertised. If you had a rented house, a respectable name, and enough social credit to attract a handful of local families, you could open a school by next Monday. You could call it a seminary. You could promise music, French, deportment, and the moral refinement of young minds. You could charge 40 guineas a year, and nobody, not the church, not the magistrate, not the father handing over his daughter, would ever verify a word of it. Think about what that means for a moment. You'd check the references of a servant entering your house. You'd want some evidence of training from a doctor treating your child. But the woman who would feed, house, discipline, and shape your daughter for years at a time, nobody checked, nobody asked. The system ran on reputation alone, and reputation, without oversight, is just hope in better clothes. Now imagine you're a father in 1810, a prosperous draper, let's say, in a market town in Hampshire. Your daughter is 11. You've decided she needs finishing, a year or two of music and French and needlework. You open the local newspaper. 3 schools are advertising. Each one promises accomplishments. Each one mentions moral attention. Each one uses the phrase a limited number of young ladies. How do you choose? You ask around. You listen for names. A neighbour's wife mentions that her niece attended such and such school and came back speaking decent French. That's your evidence. That's everything you have. You write to the headmistress. She sends a printed prospectus, listing subjects you can barely evaluate. You visit, perhaps. You see a tidy house, a clean schoolroom, a woman who speaks well and seems serious. You sign the fee book. You hand over your daughter, and from that moment you have no real idea what happens inside that house. Consider the woman who called herself Madame La Tournelle. Her real name was Sarah Hackett. She was English, born in England, raised in England, and by every available account she didn't speak French, not meaningfully, and yet when she became headmistress of the Reading Abbey Girls' School in Berkshire, she adopted a French name, presented herself as woman of continental cultivation, and used that invented identity to draw paying families to her school. And nobody questioned it. Why would they? French was fashionable. A French-sounding headmistress implied elegance, culture, a standard of education that an ordinary English spinster couldn't claim. Sarah Hackett understood something essential about the boarding school trade. The label mattered more than the contents, which as a business instinct was genuinely impressive, just not in the way a teacher should be impressive. The school itself occupied the Abbey Gateway in Reading, a medieval stone building with arched doorways and thick walls. It had once belonged to the monks of Reading Abbey. It looked serious. It looked scholarly. It looked like a place where real education happened behind those old walls. What actually happened was rather different. Mrs. La Tournelle, as students and staff called her, had what one former pupil described as a casual approach to education. She didn't teach, not in any practical sense. Her days were taken up by the work of running a household full of girls, organising meals, overseeing the laundry, making sure the roof didn't leak. These aren't small tasks when you're housing a dozen children in a medieval building, and they consumed most of her attention. When she wasn't managing the house, she talked about the theatre. She loved the stage. She loved actors and actresses with real, unfeigned enthusiasm. She'd tell stories about performances she'd seen, gossip about players she admired, talk about the world behind the curtain, to staff, to visitors, to anyone who'd sit still. including the girls she was supposed to be educating. The actual teaching fell to assistant women and visiting masters, men who came in for a few hours to give music or drawing lessons, and women who handled the daily instruction in reading, writing, and needlework. The headmistress, whose French name appeared on the prospectus, spent her time as a housekeeper who happened to love the theatre. If you're picturing something charming, you're not wrong. In a certain light, this sounds charming. An eccentric woman in a medieval building telling tales of the London stage to rooms full of teenage girls. No harm done. An amusing footnote in the history of English education. But look at it from the parents' side. A family has stretched its income, genuinely stretched it, to send a daughter to this school. They believe the woman in charge is a qualified French educator. The name says so. The prospectus says so. The old stone building says so. In fact, she's an English housekeeper who can't speak the language she claims to teach, and nobody knows, because nobody checks. We know what the school was actually like partly because of Mary Martha Sherwood, who later became one of the most widely read children's authors in England. Sherwood boarded at the Abbey School around 1790, when she was about 15. Her memoir, published decades later, paints a vivid picture, the kind of detail that puts you inside the room. She described the lessons as ill-organised. She remembered a housekeeper, not the headmistress, but an actual housekeeper, who had a wooden leg, and she recalled, with particular clarity, the French aristocrats who had fled the Revolution and sometimes appeared in the school's gardens. They danced among the flower beds. They told their stories of exile to any student who happened to be nearby. The most memorable teachers at the Abbey School weren't on the payroll. They were refugees who wandered in from the garden. Sherwood also remembered the freedom, and this detail, if you'd been there, would have surprised you most. The Abbey School was so loosely managed that the older girls had stretches of unsupervised time. They could wander the grounds. They could read what they liked. They could explore the old ruins of the Abbey itself, climbing over stones that had been there since the 12th century. The younger girls were more closely watched, but even they found gaps in the surveillance. Corners of the building where no teacher went. Moments in the afternoon when the headmistress was busy with the accounts and the assistants were occupied elsewhere. In a way, the Abbey School's incompetence was its saving grace. Because the headmistress wasn't interested in control, the girls had room to breathe, room to think, room to develop the inner lives that a more efficient school might have crushed. But that freedom came at a cost. The education was thin. The accomplishments were half-learned. The girls left the school with just enough polish to satisfy a parent who didn't look too closely, and not enough substance to survive serious scrutiny. The school took the money, provided the appearance, and hoped the appearance would be sufficient. For families who could afford a genuinely good school, one with a competent headmistress, real teachers, proper resources, the outcome might be different. Such schools existed. They were run by women who took the work seriously, who hired qualified masters, who maintained standards of teaching that went beyond the basics. But these were the exception. The typical school, the one most families could afford, was closer to the Abbey, a rented house, a self-taught headmistress, a handful of visiting masters who came when they were paid and stayed only as long as they had to. Jane Austen arrived at the same school earlier, in 1785 at the age of 9. She and her sister Cassandra stayed about 18 months. Austen left no direct account of the school in her surviving letters, but scholars believe she drew on it for Mrs. Goddard's establishment in Emma. A real, honest, old-fashioned boarding school, she wrote, where a reasonable quantity of accomplishments were sold at a reasonable price. Sold. She chose that word carefully. She always did. But Sarah Hackett, for all her theatrical pretensions, was at least harmless. The girls were fed. The building was standing, nobody got hurt. The same could not be said for every woman who opened a school and hung a sign above the door. Which brings us to Mrs. Anne Corley. Mrs. Corley was the widow of a former principal of Brasenose College, Oxford. That credential carried immediate weight. The wife of an Oxford man. It suggested learning, moral seriousness, scholarly discipline. She ran a small establishment in Oxford, taking in girls from respectable families. In 1783, two of those girls were Jane Austen, aged 7, and her sister Cassandra, aged 10. Their cousin, Jane Cooper, was also enrolled, 7 years old. Think about that for a moment. Your daughter, at 7, placed in the care of a stranger, in a city she doesn't know, in a house she's never seen, because the stranger's late husband once held a title at a university. The school ran normally for a time. Then, and you can probably sense where this is going, an outbreak, likely measles, struck the Oxford area. Mrs. Corley's response was to relocate. She moved the school and the girls to Southampton. Southampton in 1783 was a busy port. Ships arrived from the continent. Soldiers returned from campaigns, and with them came disease. Shortly after the school settled into its new quarters, a sickness spread through the town. The girls fell ill. The fever was severe. Contemporary accounts call it putrid fever, which historians identify as most likely typhus. Typhus carried by lice, spreading fast in crowded conditions. Typhus in children can kill, and Mrs. Corley didn't tell the parents. She didn't write to the Austens. She didn't contact the Coopers. The children, 7, 10, and 11 years old, were seriously ill in a port town a long day's ride from their homes, and the woman whose job was to care for them chose silence. Whether this was paralysis, negligence, or the cold calculation that a disease outbreak would destroy her reputation, we can't know. What we know is the silence, days of it. It was broken by a child, Jane Cooper, the girl's cousin, sick herself, wrote a letter home. She told her mother what was happening. That letter, written by a frightened girl in a house full of fever, almost certainly saved lives. Mrs. Austen and Mrs. Cooper, imagine your own mother receiving a letter like that, left immediately. They found the children weakened, feverish, and desperately in need of care. Jane Austen was so ill she required a long convalescence at home. She was 7 years old. She nearly died because a woman who was being paid to look after her didn't think to send a letter. All 3 girls survived. But Mrs. Cooper, Jane Cooper's mother, the woman who'd rushed to Southampton to rescue other people's children, contracted the fever during the trip. She died. A mother died because a schoolmistress stayed silent, and nothing happened afterward. Nothing. Let that settle for a moment, because if you've been following closely, you already know what's coming. No inquiry, no investigation, no new regulation. No law required Mrs. Corley to have reported the illness. No authority existed to discipline her. She was a private citizen running a private household. If a child sickened, if a parent died, that was a private sorrow. The system didn't have a word for it. The Cooper family buried their mother. The Austen family nursed their daughters back to health. George Austen, Jane's father, a clergyman who had trusted in a widow's respectability, now understood what that trust had cost. His 7-year-old daughter had been close to death. His niece had lost a parent, and the woman who had caused all of it by her silence would face no consequences whatsoever. It took years for the family to recover. Jane Austen herself never forgot it. When she later wrote about schools, with this precise, almost surgical irony of hers, she wasn't inventing, she was remembering. The 7-year-old girl who lay ill in Southampton while the adults who were supposed to protect her did nothing. That girl grew into the woman who would write about polite society's failures with an intelligence that has never been surpassed. And Mrs. Corley? She disappeared from the historical record, quietly, the way people do when there's no system to hold them accountable, no trial, no hearing, no investigation, just silence. The same silence she'd practiced during the typhus outbreak, extended now across the rest of her life. This is the reality that hid beneath the polished language of the advertisements. The woman running your daughter's school might have been a dedicated teacher doing her honest best. Or she might have been Sarah Hackett, pretending to be French. Or she might have been Anne Corley, watching children burn with fever and saying nothing. You paid your money, you sent your daughter, and you hoped for the best. The financial pressure running through the entire system, and this is something you need to understand, because it explains almost everything that went wrong, made everything worse. These schools weren't charities, they were businesses, and for many headmistresses the school was the only thing standing between them and destitution. If enrolment dropped, you cut costs, cheaper food, fewer fires, less fabric for repairs. If a family complained, you soothed them carefully. Losing one student could mean losing 3, because mothers talked and reputation travelled faster than the mail coach. And if disease appeared, you faced a terrible calculation. Report it honestly, and every parent might pull their daughter out within the week. Your income would vanish, your school would close, you'd be a widow again, with nothing. Or you could keep quiet, treat the girls yourself, hope the sickness passed, and pray that nobody wrote a letter home. The incentives of the system pointed in the worst possible direction. Transparency could ruin you. Silence could save your livelihood. And the girls, the actual children at the centre of all of it, had no voice, no advocate, and no one whose job it was to protect them. But the story is more tangled than heroes and villains. The women running these schools were caught in the same machine as their students. A world that gave women almost no options, then blamed them when those options produced harm. Mrs. Corley's silence cost a woman her life, but Mrs. Corley herself was a widow, alone, financially dependent on her school, operating without training, without regulation, and without anyone to turn to when everything collapsed around her. The system didn't fail because bad people ran it. It failed because nobody ran it. There were no standards, no oversight, no protection. Just a collection of private houses, private women, and private children, and a society that looked the other way because looking closely would have required admitting the whole arrangement was built on nothing. What mattered, in the end, wasn't whether these women were good or bad. What mattered was that between them and the children in their care there was nothing. No safeguard, no standard, no one watching. And behind those closed doors, a daily routine was taking shape. One that started before dawn and didn't end until the last candle guttered out. A routine that would have surprised, and possibly alarmed, any parent who still trusted the promises in that neatly printed prospectus. Let's walk through it. A full day, from the moment you opened your eyes to the moment you were allowed to close them again. Because the routine is where the real school lived. Not in the prospectus, not in the advertisements, in the hours. The same hours, every day, designed not to educate you but to shape you. The way water shapes stone, by repetition, by pressure, by the sheer weight of unchanging time. It's winter. The year doesn't matter. It could be 1805. It could be 1820. The routine barely changed across 3 decades. You wake before 6, not because you want to, because a bell rings, or a teacher opens the dormitory door, or someone pulls the curtain back and the grey morning light hits your face. Your first conscious sensation is cold. The dormitory is unheated. The window might be open a crack. Fresh air was considered healthy even in January. Your breath makes small clouds in the dim room. The sheets are thin. The blanket is adequate, but only just. Around you, other girls are stirring. Some have been awake for minutes already, lying still, putting off the moment. You get up. You dress yourself. Buttons, petticoats, stays. Nobody helps you. There's a washstand in the corner of the room, a basin and a pitcher of water that was cold when it was put there the night before and is colder now. You splash it on your face and hands. If the school is well run, there's a cloth to dry with. If it isn't, you dry on your petticoat and hope nobody notices. This is the first thing the school teaches you before any lesson begins. Discomfort is normal. Cold is normal. Doing without is not a hardship, it's the standard. Prayers come next. The whole school gathers, in the parlour or the largest room or the hallway if the school is small enough. The headmistress or a senior teacher leads a morning devotion. Readings from Scripture, a prayer for guidance, a reminder that piety, humility, and obedience are the foundations of a Christian woman's character. These aren't optional. Moral instruction wasn't a subject in these schools. It was the atmosphere. It was in the prayers before breakfast, in the corrections during lessons, in the rules that governed when you could speak and when you couldn't. The goal wasn't just to teach you right from wrong. The goal was to make sure you never considered that the rules themselves might be questionable. After prayers, breakfast. And breakfast is a good place to understand how money shaped every hour of the day. If your parents were paying the standard fee, breakfast was simple. Bread. Perhaps butter, if the school could afford it. Tea, or more often, cambric tea, which was hot water with a splash of milk and the faintest suggestion of actual tea leaves. It was warm. It was filling enough to stop a child from complaining. It was not what your parents imagined when they read the words, "every attention to health," in the prospectus. If your parents were paying extra, if you were what the schools called a parlour boarder, your morning looked different. You might eat at the headmistress's own table, better bread, real tea, perhaps an egg. You'd sit in the private parlour while the other girls ate in the schoolroom, and everyone would know exactly which category you belonged to. The parlour boarder system was, in its way, the school's most honest feature. It didn't pretend class didn't exist. It displayed it openly, every morning, at the breakfast table. You were either at the headmistress's table or you weren't. And the girls who weren't saw the ones who were, and learned a lesson that no curriculum ever listed, that your worth was measured by what your father could pay. After breakfast, the schoolroom. And here is where the gap between advertisement and reality became impossible to ignore. The prospectus might have listed 10 subjects: reading, writing, grammar, arithmetic, geography, history, French, music, drawing, needlework. It looked impressive on paper. In practice, the teaching often happened all at once, in a single room, with 1 or 2 women trying to manage a dozen girls of different ages and different abilities at the same time. One contemporary account describes the noise: multiple girls practicing piano simultaneously, not in separate rooms, but in the same room, or in rooms so close together that every melody bled into every other. Other girls reciting grammar or geography to a teacher who was trying to listen to 3 students at once. The overall sound was described as a hideous clatter, not the focused, disciplined silence of a serious academy. A noisy, chaotic household where learning happened in fragments, between interruptions, when it happened at all. The schoolroom itself was usually the largest room in the house. It might have been a drawing room before the school took it over, or a dining room, or simply the biggest room available. The furniture was functional, long tables or individual desks depending on what the headmistress could afford. The chairs were hard and straight-backed. The floor was bare wood or stone, cold in winter, swept but never quite clean. The light came from windows that might face any direction. If you were lucky, the room caught the morning sun. If you weren't, you spent the day in grey half-light, squinting at your work. Candles were used sparingly, they were expensive, and the headmistress watched the household accounts the way a captain watches the horizon. Every candle burned was money spent. The walls might hold a map or two, a globe if the school had one. Perhaps a small shelf of books, the same books every girl would use, read and return. The pianoforte stood in a corner, its keys yellowed, its tuning never quite right. There might be a fire in winter, but it would be small, and you'd have to be close to it to feel any warmth. The girls at the far end of the room would work with cold fingers, blowing on them between stitches, their breath visible in the air. This was where you spent most of your waking hours. 6 hours a day, sometimes more, in this room, with these desks, these windows, these other girls. The room became your world. You knew every crack in the plaster, every draught from the door, every sound the floorboards made when someone walked across them. You could identify which girl was approaching by her footsteps, the way a prisoner learns the rhythms of a cell. Your French lesson might last 20 minutes, delivered by a visiting master who was shared among 3 schools and had to leave by noon to reach the next one. Your music lesson depended on whether the master came that week. He was paid by the hour, and if the school was behind on his fees, he might not show up. Your arithmetic was whatever the assistant teacher knew, which might not extend far beyond simple addition and subtraction. The needlework, though, the needlework was real, because needlework could be done in silence for hours, with minimal supervision. It didn't require a visiting master or a specialized teacher. It required a hoop, a needle, a length of linen, and patience. And patience was the one thing these schools had in abundance. You'd sit at your place, the hoop in your lap, the needle moving in and out of the fabric, the thread catching the light. Around you, other girls doing the same, the room quiet except for the occasional murmur, the creak of a chair, the soft sound of thread being pulled through cloth. Hours could pass like this, and the school would count those hours as education, because the product being manufactured wasn't knowledge. It was the appearance of a woman who could sit still, keep her hands busy, and say nothing. The visiting masters were a world unto themselves. These were men, always men, who came in from outside to teach the prestigious subjects. Music, dancing, sometimes French or drawing. They were paid separately, often poorly, and they moved between schools like circuit preachers, giving an hour here and an hour there. A dancing master might arrive on a Tuesday afternoon. The girls would line up in the largest room. He'd demonstrate a figure. They'd practice. He'd correct their posture, their arm placement, their footwork, and then he'd leave, and they wouldn't see him again for a week. A week of no practice between lessons, lest the school had another girl who knew the steps well enough to lead the others. The music master came for the pianoforte. He'd sit beside each girl in turn, listening to what she'd practiced, or hadn't, and adjusting her fingering. If there were 10 girls learning piano, he'd spend perhaps 6 minutes with each. An hour gone, next school. This is what £10,000 a year bought you. 6 minutes of personal instruction from a man who was already thinking about his next appointment. The midday dinner was the main meal. It arrived around 1 o'clock, and the girls gathered in whatever room served as the dining area, sometimes the schoolroom itself, with the books and hoops cleared to one side. The food varied by school and by season. Boiled mutton was common, boiled beef, potatoes, bread, always. A pudding if the school could manage it, suet pudding, rice pudding, bread and butter pudding, heavy, starchy, designed to fill rather than nourish. The quality depended entirely on the headmistress's budget and her cook's ability. At the better schools the meat was fresh and the vegetables were edible. At the cheaper ones the mutton might be gristly, the potatoes watery, the bread stale. You ate what was served, you didn't refuse it. Refusing food was a form of ingratitude, and ingratitude, you'd learned this by your first week, was the worst thing a girl could show. The smell of that dining room stays in every memoir that describes it. Boiled meat and tallow candles and damp wool, the table covered in a cloth that was washed once a week, plates that were plain white earthenware, cutlery that didn't match. The girls ate in near silence, watched by the teacher at the head of the table, who monitored their manners with the same attention she gave to their needlework. Even eating was a performance. How you held your fork, how you chewed. Whether you took too large a bite, or ate too quickly, or left food on your plate. The table was another classroom, and the lesson was the same one being taught everywhere else in the building. Control yourself. Discipline your body. Show nothing that hasn't been approved. After dinner, a brief period of rest, though rest is a generous word. You might sit in the garden if the weather allowed. You might be permitted to read if the book was approved. You might talk quietly with the other girls, though loud conversation was discouraged. This was the closest thing to free time the school offered, and it lasted perhaps 30 minutes before the afternoon routine resumed. The geography lessons are worth pausing on, because they show how thin the education really was. The teacher would stand at the front of the room with a rolled map, usually of Europe, sometimes of the world. She'd point at countries and name them. The girls would repeat. She'd ask questions. What is the capital of France? What river flows through London? The answers were memorized, not understood. Nobody explained why these facts mattered. Nobody connected them to the world outside the schoolroom walls. A girl could leave one of these schools able to name every country in Europe, point to Persia on a map, and recite the major rivers of England, and still have no genuine understanding of the world she lived in. She knew facts the way she knew embroidery stitches, as patterns to be reproduced on demand without context or meaning. History was taught the same way. Names and dates, kings and queens, battles won and lost, memorized from a textbook, recited on request, and forgotten within the year. The schools weren't interested in teaching girls to think about history. They were interested in giving girls enough facts to sustain a polite conversation, enough to seem educated without actually being educated. The afternoon brought more of the same, but slower. The light in the schoolroom shifted. The energy in the room settled. By 3 or 4 o'clock the accomplishments gave way to plainer work. Reading aloud, darning. Perhaps a geography lesson conducted by a tired teacher pointing at a map. The girls grew quiet. Not the quiet of concentration, but the quiet of exhaustion. The slow, heavy stillness that comes from hours of sitting in one place, doing as you're told, with no freedom and no variety. At some point in the afternoon, you'd walk. The whole school would go into the back garden, or onto the lane outside the house in pairs, supervised, watched. You'd walk for exercise, not pleasure. and you'd walk in the company of girls you hadn't chosen and might not like. The fresh air was considered important. It counteracted the closeness of the schoolroom. But the walking itself was another form of discipline. How you walked mattered. How you held your arms. How you inclined your head when passing a stranger. Even the afternoon walk was a lesson. And during these walks, the social world of the school revealed itself. You'd feel it before you understood it. Because there was a hierarchy among the girls, and it had nothing to do with talent or kindness or intelligence. It was built entirely on money. The parlour boarders, the girls whose families paid the highest fees, occupied the top. They ate better food. They had access to the headmistress's private rooms. Some had privileges the other girls could see but never share. A better seat by the fire, an extra blanket, a cup of real tea instead of cambric. These girls moved through the school with a confidence that came not from ability, but from their father's income. Below them, the ordinary boarders, the majority, girls whose families, girls like you, if we're keeping up the fiction, paid the standard fee and received the standard experience. They shared dormitories, ate plain meals and waited their turn for everything. They were aware, acutely, constantly aware, of the girls above them. Every meal was a reminder. Every privilege observed and not shared was a small lesson in position. And in some schools, below even the ordinary boarders, there were girls on reduced fees or charitable placements. Daughters of clergymen too poor to afford the full rate. Girls whose tuition was partially covered by a benefactor's generosity. These girls occupied an uneasy space, present by sufferance, grateful by expectation, and always aware that their place could be withdrawn. The school, in other words, was training you for the world you'd enter after you left, not by teaching you about class structure, but by making you live inside one. The drawing room you'd eventually perform in would have the same unspoken rankings, the same quiet cruelties, the same careful awareness of who belonged and who was merely tolerated. The world between the girls was complicated in other ways too. Friendships formed. They had to, because who else did you have? You shared a room with these girls. You ate every meal with them. You walked with them, sewed beside them, prayed beside them. Some of those friendships became deep and real, forged in the particular intimacy of shared confinement. Some of them lasted decades. But friendships in boarding schools also carried an edge. Competition was constant, even if it was never named. Whose needlework was neatest? Whose French was least embarrassing? Who caught the dancing master's approval? The school might not have graded you, but the girls graded each other, and in a world where your value depended entirely on how well you performed, every other girl was both your companion and your rival. The cruelty, when it came, was quiet. And if you remember your own school days, you'll recognize the texture of it. A whispered comment about the state of your dress, a meaningful look exchanged between two girls when you stumbled over a French phrase, the slow, deliberate exclusion from a conversation during the afternoon walk, not by any one act, but by the way the group closed and opened around certain people. You'd find yourself walking at the edge of the pair, half a step behind, close enough to hear the laughter, but not close enough to join it. These weren't dramatic confrontations. There were no fights, no raised voices. The girls had been trained too well for that. The cruelty was performed with the same smoothness as every other accomplishment, elegantly, quietly, and with plausible deniability. If you complained, the teacher would see nothing wrong. If you cried, you'd be told you were too sensitive. The girls who were best at social cruelty were often the girls the teachers admired most, the polished ones, the poised ones, the ones who'd mastered the art of appearing kind while being anything but. And so you learned another lesson, not from the curriculum, not from the teachers, from the girls around you. You learned that the world you were being trained to enter was not a kind one, that the drawing rooms and dinner tables of polite society would be governed by the same rules, the same quiet hierarchies, the same elegant exclusions, the same careful performances of warmth that concealed indifference or dislike. The boarding school wasn't just preparing you for that world, it was an early, concentrated version of it. Sundays were different, but not easier. The routine shifted from instruction to religion. You'd attend church, either walking to the local parish or gathering in the school's largest room for a private service. The headmistress would choose the reading. The moral instruction that ran through the week like a thread would on Sundays become the entire fabric. You'd spend the rest of the day in quiet. No needlework. That was considered too close to labour for the Sabbath. No music practice. No lessons. Just reading, prayer, and stillness. For some girls, Sunday was the closest thing to rest they had. For others, it was the hardest day. Hours of enforced quiet with nothing to occupy your hands, nothing to distract your mind from the fact that you were far from home and no one had written to you this week. The seasons mark the only real change. In winter, the cold deepened everything. The dormitory was hard to leave. The water in the basin sometimes had a film of ice on it. The schoolroom fire, if there was one, would be built small and burn fast, taking the worst edge off the chill without ever making the room warm. Your fingers would stiffen during needlework. The ink might thicken in the well before you'd finished your writing exercise. In summer, the light lasted longer and the walks were more pleasant. The garden might bloom, the windows could be opened wider, but the routine stayed the same prayers, the same breakfast, the same schoolroom, the same needlework, the same supervised silence. The only thing the seasons changed was the temperature of the water in the basin. Supper was early, 5 or 6 o'clock. It was plain. Bread again, perhaps with cheese, a little meat if the school was generous, the same cambric tea. The fire, if there was one, would be burning low by this hour. The room would smell of tallow candles and whatever had been cooked for the evening. After supper, the evening hours, these were structured too. Reading aloud from an approved book, usually something moral, often religious. Needlework again, in silence. Perhaps a girl would be asked to play something on the piano for the others, as practice. The headmistress or her assistant would sit with them, watching, correcting, maintaining the atmosphere of quiet industry that the school was built to produce, and then bed. The candles would be put out. Candles were expensive, and every minute of light cost money. You'd undress in the near dark. You'd wash your face again with cold water. You'd climb into the narrow bed with its thin sheets, and you'd lie there in the cold room listening to the breathing of the girls around you. If you were new, you might cry, quietly, into the pillow, because crying aloud would be reported and corrected. If you'd been here for months, you wouldn't cry. You'd stare at the ceiling or the shadow of the window on the wall, and you'd wait for sleep, and eventually it would come. But sleep brought its own discomforts. The beds were narrow, the mattresses were stuffed with horsehair or straw, and they sagged in the middle after years of use. If you shared a room with 6 or 8 other girls, you'd hear every movement, every cough, every restless turn. A girl having a nightmare might cry out in her sleep, and the sound would carry through the room, and you'd lie there listening, wondering whether to wake her or let her be. In winter, the cold was the real companion. It crept into the bed from all sides. You'd curl up tight, pulling the blanket over your shoulders, and still the cold would find the gaps. Your feet would go numb. Your nose would ache. And in the morning, when the bell rang or the door opened, you'd feel the full weight of it. The difference between the small warmth you'd built under the blanket and the air of the room, which had been cooling all night while the fire, if there had been one, died to ash. That moment, the moment of leaving the bed, was perhaps the hardest part of every day, because it was the moment when the school's control reasserted itself. In sleep, you'd been free. Your body had been your own. You'd curled and stretched and moved without permission. And now, with the grey light coming through the window and the basin of cold water waiting, you had to give that freedom back. Every morning, for months, for years. The school demanded that surrender, and you gave it. Not because you wanted to, because there was nothing else to do. Tomorrow would be the same, and the day after that, and the week after that, and the term after that. The routine didn't change because it wasn't supposed to. It was designed to be unchanging, to press you into a shape the way a mould presses clay, day after day after day, until the shape held on its own. But the routine was only the visible layer. Beneath it, something else was happening, something that left marks no prospectus ever mentioned and no parent was ever warned about, because the daily schedule was designed to shape your behaviour. But there were other tools, physical tools, designed to shape your body. The most common was the backboard. Before we talk about the devices, though, it's important to understand the larger idea they were serving, because the backboard wasn't invented by boarding schools. It was part of a wider culture of body management that applied to all women and girls of the middle and upper classes. The female body, in Regency thinking, was a problem to be solved. It was soft where it should be firm. It curved where it should be straight. It moved in ways that were natural but improper. The job of education was to override nature, to replace the body's instincts with disciplined, externally imposed control. This wasn't hidden. It was stated openly in conduct books and medical texts and educational treatises. The female body was, by its nature, weak and pliable. Left to its own devices, it would develop badly. The spine would curve, the shoulders would droop, the posture would slump. And since posture was understood as a direct expression of character, a body that slumped was a character that was failing. The correction had to begin early, had to be consistent, and had to continue until the new shape was permanent. That's the philosophy. Now let's talk about the machinery. If you've never seen one, picture a flat piece of wood, roughly the width of a girl's back and the length of her torso. It was strapped to the body during lessons, held in place by ties at the shoulders and waist, so that the girl couldn't slouch, couldn't curve her spine, couldn't lean forward or shift her weight, or do any of the small unconscious adjustments a body makes when it's been sitting in one position for too long. You'd sit at your desk with this board pressed against your back, holding you upright, while you tried to write or read or do needlework. Your shoulders would ache. The edge of the board would dig into the flesh below your shoulder blades. Your lower back would cramp from being held in an unnatural position. And you'd stay like that for hours, because the board wasn't a punishment, it was the lesson. Good posture in the world of the Regency boarding school was not simply a physical preference, it was a moral statement. An upright body meant an upright character. A girl who stood straight was a girl who could be trusted. A girl who slouched was lazy. undisciplined, possibly morally suspect. The connection between the spine and the soul was taken seriously, not metaphorically, but as a genuine article of educational philosophy, and so the backboard stayed on, not as correction, as formation. But the backboard was only the beginning. Some schools use steel rod harnesses. These were more elaborate than the simple wooden board. A steel rod, or sometimes a pair of rods, ran the length of the spine. Straps secured it at the shoulders, the waist, and in some designs at the base of the skull. The girl's head was held in position. She couldn't look down. She couldn't turn to the side. She was locked into a single, rigid, forward-facing alignment while she sat through her lessons. Imagine sitting in that device for 2 hours, 3 hours. Imagine trying to write while your head is strapped to a steel rod and your shoulders are pulled back so far that your arms can barely reach the desk. Imagine the ache building in your neck, in the muscles of your upper back, in the small of your spine, and knowing that the ache is what the school considers progress. These devices weren't hidden. They weren't shameful secrets kept from parents. They were part of the curriculum. Parents knew, or at least they could have known if they'd asked. The ideology that justified them was spoken aloud, printed in prospectuses, accepted by the medical establishment of the time. Straight posture was healthy. It prevented deformities. It built character. The devices that enforced it were tools of improvement, not instruments of cruelty. At least, that was the theory. In practice, what you had was a room full of girls between the ages of 7 and 16, strapped into wooden or metal devices that restricted their movement, caused them pain, and taught them, above all else, that their bodies were not their own, that their bodies were projects to be corrected, that the way they naturally sat, stood, and moved was wrong and needed to be fixed by someone who knew better. Then there was the neck swing. This was rarer and more extreme. The girl would be placed in a kind of harness that supported her head and neck. In some versions, attributed to a practitioner known as Monsieur le Vacher, the child would be partially suspended, her feet lifted from the ground, with her full weight hanging from the apparatus around her neck and jaw. The stated purpose was to elongate the spine, to stretch the vertebrae into perfect alignment. Whether this was comfortable is not a question that requires answering. Mary Martha Sherwood, the same woman who attended Sarah Hackett's school in Reading, and whose name you'll remember from earlier, left one of the most detailed accounts of what these devices felt like from the inside. She described being placed in an iron collar as a child, worn during lessons, that held her chin up and her neck rigid. She described stocks, wooden devices that clamped around the feet and ankles, used to keep younger girls still during study hours. And she described the backboard with the quiet precision of someone who had spent years of her childhood strapped to one. I was always in disgrace, she wrote in her autobiography, recalling the correction she endured as a child. The devices were not reserved for the disobedient. They were applied to all girls, as standard equipment. The iron collar, the stocks, the backboard. These weren't punishments. They were furniture. And that distinction matters, because when you understand that these devices were routine, not exceptional, not reserved for badly behaved girls, but worn by every student as part of the daily timetable, the picture changes entirely. This wasn't discipline in response to wrongdoing. This was a belief system made physical. The school believed that a girl's natural body was insufficient, and that the only path to refinement was mechanical force applied over time. Imagine your first morning in one of these devices. You're 10 years old. You've been at the school for a week. The teacher calls you forward and turns you around. She lifts the backboard, it's heavier than you expected, and positions it against your spine. She ties the straps at your shoulders, pulling them snug, then the waist strap. Your chest is pushed forward, your shoulders are pulled back, your lower back is pressed flat against the wood. It doesn't hurt, not immediately. It feels odd, unfamiliar. Your body wants to adjust, to shift, to find a position that's comfortable. But the board doesn't allow adjustment. It holds you in one shape. After 15 minutes, the unfamiliarity becomes discomfort. After 30, the discomfort becomes an ache. After an hour, the ache becomes a steady, grinding pain in the muscles along your spine, in the tendons of your shoulders, in the base of your neck, and you sit with it, because the other girls are sitting with it, because the teacher expects you to sit with it, because complaining would mark you as weak, and weakness in a boarding school is the beginning of the end. The other forms of physical correction were less mechanical, but no less effective. Confinement was common, and if you think this sounds familiar, you're right. It echoes through every institution that ever held children without accountability. A girl who spoke out of turn, or who failed to complete her work, or who was judged impertinent, might be locked in a closet, or confined to the schoolroom after hours while the other girls walked in the garden, or sent to bed without supper. These weren't extreme measures by the standards of the time. Corporal punishment was accepted across all forms of education, but in a boarding school where the girl had no parent to appeal to, no home to return to at the end of the day, the isolation had a particular weight. Public correction was another tool, and you'll recognize this from every institution that's ever managed children through shame. A girl might be made to stand in front of the class while her mistakes were read aloud, or forced to wear a visible marker of her failure, a card pinned to her dress, or a particular seat at the back of the room reserved for the poorest performers. The shame was the point. In a community where reputation was everything, public humiliation was the most effective punishment available. Food restriction was sometimes used as discipline, though it varied by school. At the better-funded establishments, meals were small but consistent. At the cheaper schools, food was already so inadequate that withholding it as punishment crossed the line from correction into cruelty. But the line was invisible, and nobody was watching to see when it was crossed. And then there were the things that were never officially categorized as punishment at all. The temperature, the water, the clothing. A schoolroom kept deliberately cold because fresh air was considered healthy. A dormitory with open windows in January. Wash water drawn from a well and left overnight, so that it was barely above freezing when you splashed it on your face at 6 a.m. Clothes that were adequate for modesty but not for warmth. These weren't punishments. They were conditions. But they functioned the same way. They taught you to endure. They taught you that your comfort was irrelevant. They taught you that the body you lived in was not designed for your pleasure. It was designed for other people's purposes. Stays and early corsetry played their role too. Stays, stiffened, boned garments worn around the torso, were part of everyday dress for women and girls of the middle and upper classes. But in schools, stays served a dual purpose. They were clothing and they were correction. By restricting the torso, they made slouching physically difficult. Some schools are documented as having enforced night stays, corset-like garments laced so that the girl couldn't loosen them in her sleep. Her posture was being managed even when she was unconscious. Even in sleep, her body was not allowed to relax into its natural shape. That detail is worth pausing on. A girl lies in a narrow bed, in a cold room, in a school she didn't choose, wearing a garment she can't remove, designed to correct the shape of her body while she sleeps. That is not education. That is something else entirely. And it happened with parental consent, because parents believed, or were told to believe, that it was for the girl's own good. The rationale behind all of this was built on 3 pillars, and every one of them reinforced the others. The first was class distinction. Posture was a social marker. Working-class women laboured. They bent, lifted, hauled, and carried. Their bodies reflected that labour. An upright posture, rigid and controlled, marked you as someone who didn't need to work with her hands. It said leisure. It said status. It said, I belong in a drawing room, not a laundry. Teaching a tradesman's daughter to stand like a gentlewoman was teaching her to pass. The same performance, the same deception, the same careful illusion that ran through every accomplishment she learned, replicated in the angle of her spine. The second pillar was moral philosophy. In the thinking of the time, there was no separation between physical and moral alignment. A straight back reflected a straight conscience. Slouching wasn't just unattractive, it was a sign of a weak character, of laziness, of a mind that was not properly governed. The backboard didn't just correct posture, it corrected the girl. The third was medical theory. 18th and early 19th century medicine treated the body as a machine that needed to be kept in strict mechanical alignment. Deformities of the spine were common, partly because of poor nutrition, partly because of the restricted lives women led, and the medical profession's response was mechanical correction. Backboards and harnesses were framed not as torture, but as treatment. Doctors prescribed them, parents accepted them, schools implemented them, everyone agreed it was for the best, and the girls, the actual children inside the devices, had no say at all. There's a question that comes up, inevitably, when you describe these things. Did anyone object? Did anyone, at the time, look at a room full of children strapped to boards and say, "This is wrong"? The answer is complicated. Some medical practitioners did begin to question the devices by the 1820s and 1830s, new thinking about physical health, influenced by Enlightenment ideas about the body, about movement, about the importance of exercise rather than restriction, started to challenge the old mechanical model. Some writers on education argued that girls should be allowed to move, to run, to develop their bodies through activity rather than constraint. But these voices were few, and they were slow to be heard. The schools were conservative institutions, and the parents who sent their daughters to them were conservative people. The backboard felt right. It looked right. A girl in a backboard was a girl being improved, and the ache she felt while wearing it, that was the price of improvement. Nobody had ever said improvement was comfortable. What these tools taught more effectively than any lesson in French or music was submission. Your body doesn't belong to you. Your comfort doesn't matter. Your pain is a sign that the system is working. Hold still. Don't complain. The person strapping you in knows better than you do. That was the education, not the needlework, not the piano, not the geography or the grammar or the French. The real curriculum was compliance, and the devices made sure you learned it with your body before you learned it with your mind. We're about halfway through now, and it's getting heavy. I know, this is hard material and you've stayed with it. Take a breath if you need one. If you're lying in bed listening to this, let your shoulders drop. Let your hands go loose. You've been holding tension without realizing it. We all do, when we hear about things like backboards and iron collars. Let it go for a moment. We've got further to travel, but the road gets quieter from here. But the body was only half of it. Because there was another kind of constraint, invisible, harder to see, but in some ways more damaging, the constraint on what you could feel, what you could say, and most importantly, what you could write home about what was happening to you. In Regency England, letters were everything. They were the only connection a girl had to the family she'd left behind. No visits during term in most cases. No casual messages sent through a neighbour. If you wanted to speak to your mother, you wrote a letter, and your mother, reading it weeks later in a parlour 100 miles away, would hold that letter like a window into your life. Except the window was painted shut. Because your letters weren't private. They were an assignment. In most schools, letter writing was supervised. The teacher would set aside time, perhaps once a week, perhaps once a fortnight, for the girls to compose letters home. You'd sit at your desk, you'd take out your paper, and you'd write what you were expected to write. Gratitude first. You were grateful for the opportunity your parents had given you. You were grateful for the care of the school. You were grateful for the instruction, the meals, the moral guidance. Gratitude was the opening note of every letter, and it was not optional. Then progress. You were learning French. Your needlework was improving. The dancing master said your carriage was better this term. You were reading an improving book. You were applying yourself. Your parents' investment was producing visible returns. Then a request, politely worded, carefully modest. More writing paper. A new pair of stockings, perhaps some money for the music master's fees. Nothing extravagant, nothing that would suggest discontent or want, and that was it. That was the letter. A small, careful performance, written on paper, in ink, with the same discipline that governed everything else in the school. What you could not write was anything honest. You couldn't say the food was bad. You couldn't say the dormitory was cold. You couldn't describe the backboard. You couldn't tell your mother that you cried every night for the first 3 weeks. You couldn't explain that the headmistress was unkind or incompetent or absent. You couldn't admit that you were lonely, deeply, achingly lonely, in a room full of girls you barely knew, because your letters were read before they were sent. The teacher would review them, not always, but often enough that you could never be sure. If a letter contained complaints, it might be confiscated. If it expressed unhappiness, you might be corrected. Not punished, necessarily, just spoken to. Reminded that you should be grateful, that your parents were making sacrifices, that expressing dissatisfaction was a form of ingratitude, and ingratitude, in the moral vocabulary of a Regency boarding school, was one of the worst things a girl could be. So you learned to write letters that said nothing. Beautiful, polished, grammatically correct letters that conveyed warmth without warmth, progress without detail, and contentment without joy. You performed happiness on paper the same way you performed accomplishments in the drawing room, skillfully, convincingly, and without ever revealing what was actually going on inside you. Your mother would read the letter and feel reassured. The school was working. Her daughter was thriving. The money was well spent. She had no reason to suspect otherwise. The letter told her everything she wanted to hear, and nothing else. This is perhaps the cruelest efficiency of the whole system. The very skill it was designed to teach, the performance of a polished, pleasing exterior, was the same skill that prevented anyone from ever discovering what was happening behind it. The girls who were best at playing the part were the girls whose suffering was least visible. The system protected itself using the tools it had built into its students, and the letters coming in were no better. Your mother wrote to you too. Her letters arrived at the school, and they were often read by the headmistress before being passed to you. If they contained anything the school considered unhelpful, too much sentiment, Too many questions about the quality of the food, too much longing for home. The letter might be delayed or summarized, or in extreme cases withheld entirely. But even without interference, the letters from home were their own kind of performance. Your mother was reassuring you that everything was fine, that the family was well, that your younger siblings missed you, that they were proud of you. She was performing contentment in the same way you were, not because she was instructed to, but because the culture demanded it. A mother who wrote a weepy, longing letter to her daughter risked undermining the girl's adjustment. A steady, cheerful letter was considered good parenting. The school encouraged it. Keep the tone light. Keep the girl focused. Don't unsettle her with too much affection. So you'd receive a letter from your mother that was warm but careful, and you'd write back a letter that was grateful but empty. And between those two pieces of paper, a distance grew that neither of you could see clearly and neither of you knew how to close. Some girls went home during the holidays. Not all. Some schools kept students year-round, especially those whose families lived far away or couldn't afford the travel. But for those who did go home, the experience was often stranger than anyone expected. You'd arrive at the house you'd left 6 months or a year ago. The front door would look the same. The garden would be the same, more or less. Your mother would meet you at the step and she'd embrace you. And for a moment everything would feel as it was, but it wouldn't be, because you were different. The school had changed you, that was the point. You stood differently. You held your hands differently. You spoke more carefully. You sat with your back straight even when no one was watching, because the muscles had been trained and the habit had set in. Your mother would notice these things. She might feel pride. She might also feel something harder to name. A quiet awareness that the girl who'd come back wasn't quite the girl who'd left. And you'd feel it too. The house would seem smaller. The conversation would seem rougher. The food would be better, richer, warmer, more generous. But the table manners you'd learned at school would make you self-conscious about the way your family ate. You'd catch yourself correcting your posture at the dinner table, and your father would notice, and something in the room would shift. The school was working. It was separating you from the world you came from. That was the design. Holidays were often the moment when the full weight of what the school was doing became visible, not to the parents, who saw refinement, but to the girl, who felt the split. She was becoming two people, the school self who could perform accomplishments and write polished letters and sit perfectly still, and the home self who remembered what it felt like to run in the garden and talk loudly and eat without thinking about the angle of her wrists. The school self was winning. It had to. Because going back to school meant going back to the board, the collar, the supervised letters, the cold water, and the moral instruction, and the relentless, grinding routine. And the home self, the loud, messy, honest self, had no place there. So you put her away, carefully, the way you folded your clothes in the dormitory, neatly, out of sight. Some girls never found that self again. And here is the thing that connects all of this. The letters, the holidays, the silence, the split. And if you've been listening carefully, you've already felt it. The school wasn't just teaching you to perform, it was teaching you to forget. To forget the girl you were before. To forget the way you used to laugh without checking first whether it was appropriate. To forget the feeling of running without thinking about your posture, of speaking without choosing your words, of being in a room without performing. The boarding school didn't just add accomplishments, it subtracted something. Something that had been there before you arrived. spontaneity, honesty, the unself-conscious habit of being yourself, and that was never formally returned when you left. Some girls rebuilt it. Some found husbands who were kind enough, or lives that were spacious enough, to let the original self breathe again. But many didn't. Many spent their entire lives inside the performance, never quite sure where the role ended and the person began. And nobody noticed. Because the whole point of the performance was that nobody would. And there was another layer to this silence, because the families were making sacrifices, real financial sacrifices, to send their daughters to these schools. A clergyman spending a quarter of his income, a merchant stretching beyond his means. These weren't wealthy families indulging a luxury. These were families investing everything they had in a daughter's future. A girl at school knew this. She felt the weight of it, even if it was never spoken. Her parents had given up comfort so she could be here. They'd gone without things so she could learn to play the piano and speak French and sit up straight. And if she wrote home saying she was unhappy, if she said the school was cold or lonely or frightening, she wasn't just complaining. She was telling her parents their sacrifice had been a mistake. That's a burden no child should carry. But they carried it. In every supervised letter, in every careful phrase, in every reassuring line they composed while their backs ached and their eyes stung from tiredness, and the fire in the schoolroom had gone out hours ago. The isolation this created was profound and invisible. You were surrounded by people, girls, teachers, the headmistress, the visiting masters, and yet you were fundamentally alone with your real feelings. Nobody asked how you actually felt. Nobody wanted to know. The system required your contentment, and if your contentment wasn't real, it required your performance of contentment. Either would do. Both served the same purpose. And this is where the word accomplishment takes on its darkest meaning. Because the greatest accomplishment these schools taught wasn't music or French or needlework. It was the ability to appear fine when you weren't, to smile when you wanted to cry, to write, "I am very well and happy," when you were neither, to present, at all times, a surface so smooth and so polished that nobody would ever think to look beneath it. That skill would follow these girls for the rest of their lives, into marriage, into motherhood, into the drawing rooms and parlours and bedrooms of a world that valued the appearance of contentment far more than the reality of it. The boarding school didn't just teach you how to perform for a suitor, it taught you how to perform for everyone, forever. And for most of these girls, the performance held. The letters were sent, the parents were reassured, the school continued, the fees were paid, but sometimes the performance broke. Sometimes something happened that no letter could hide, that no amount of poise could paper over. Sometimes the body that the school was so carefully correcting, the body strapped into boards and harnesses and stays, simply broke down. Not from the devices, from something worse, something that lived in the cold dormitories, in the crowded schoolrooms, in the water and the food and the air of a building full of children pressed too close together. Disease. And when it came, it didn't care about accomplishments. We've already seen what happened at Mrs. Corley's school in 1783. The typhus outbreak, the silence, the death of a mother who came to rescue the children. That story is devastating on its own, but it wasn't unique. Disease was a constant shadow over these institutions, and the conditions inside them made outbreaks not just possible but likely. Think about the physical reality. A dozen girls, sometimes more, sleeping in one room, windows kept open for health, admitting cold air, but never properly ventilating the space, water drawn from local wells that might be contaminated, food that was cheap, sometimes spoiled, and almost always inadequate in nutrition, chamber pots shared, linens washed infrequently, lice, fleas, and bed bugs as common as the furniture they lived in. This was the standard. Not the worst-case scenario, the standard. Typhus, scarlet fever, measles, whooping cough, tuberculosis, the slow killer, the one that, if you'd heard the cough in the dormitory beside yours, you'd learn to dread. These diseases move through boarding schools the way fire moves through dry wood. Fast, indiscriminate, and nearly impossible to stop once they'd started. And the response was almost always the same. The school tried to manage it privately. A doctor might be called, if the school could afford one. The sick girls would be isolated, if there was a room available, and the parents might be told, if the headmistress decided the situation was serious enough to risk the school's reputation. If. The records, where they exist, suggest that outbreaks were not rare events. They were seasonal realities. Winter brought the worst of it. Closed rooms, poor ventilation, weakened immune systems from cold and inadequate food. A school might go years without a serious outbreak, then lose 3 girls in a single term. The pattern was unpredictable and terrifying for the families, who had no way of knowing whether the school their daughter attended was safe until it wasn't. Some families pulled their daughters out at the first rumour of illness. Some couldn't afford to. The fees were paid in advance, and removing a girl mid-term meant losing the money. Some trusted the headmistress to manage the situation, and some, this is the part that should give you pause, simply didn't hear about it until it was too late. The schools themselves had few resources to fight disease. A doctor might be called, but doctors in the early 19th century had limited tools. They could bleed the patient. They could prescribe rest and fluids. They could offer moral support and a grave expression. What they couldn't do was cure typhus or treat tuberculosis or stop scarlet fever from spreading through a dormitory of 12 children sleeping in the same room. The girls who nursed each other, and they did because in many schools the sick were tended by the other students, not by professional carers, were themselves at risk. A healthy girl assigned to sit with a feverish one might be fine, or she might develop symptoms within the week. The school's response was usually to carry on, adjusting as needed, and hope the worst had passed. But the story that cut deepest, the one that became the most famous, because one of the girls who survived it grew up to write one of the most important novels in the English language, happened in a village called Cowan Bridge in Lancashire. The school was called the Clergy Daughters' School. It was founded in 1824 by a man named William Carus Wilson, a clergyman himself, a man of strong evangelical convictions, and a man who believed that the daughters of poor clergymen deserved a Christian education at a price their fathers could afford. The fees were low, £14 a year. That was the selling point. For families who couldn't afford 40 guineas, £14 was an invitation they couldn't refuse. Wilson raised additional funding through charitable subscriptions and managed the school himself, applying his religious principles to every aspect of its operation. The principles were severe. Wilson believed in obedience, discipline, and the mortification of the flesh as a path to spiritual improvement. Comfort was suspicious. Pleasure was dangerous. Suffering, properly endured, brought you closer to God. These weren't unusual beliefs for an evangelical clergyman of the period, but when you applied them to the daily management of a school full of young girls, the results were punishing. The food was bad, not just plain, actively unpleasant. Accounts describe burned porridge, rancid meat, and meals so poorly prepared that the girls could barely eat them. The portions were small. Hunger was constant. When the girls couldn't finish the spoiled food, they were expected to eat it anyway, because waste was a sin and appetite was a weakness to be governed. The water came from a local source and may not have been clean. The building was damp, poorly heated, and difficult to keep sanitary. The girls walked to church in all weather, 1.5 miles each way, in clothes that weren't always adequate for the cold. Their shoes leaked. Their dresses were thin. They arrived at the church wet and chilled, sat through the service and walked back again. Imagine that walk, a January morning. The ground is frozen. Your shoes are worn through at the sole, and the cold of the road comes up through the leather like a blade. You're walking in line with the other girls, 2 by 2, supervised by a teacher who is herself cold, but who would never admit it. Your dress is damp from yesterday. It didn't dry overnight because the building is never warm enough to dry anything properly. Your fingers are raw. Your breath clouds the air in front of you, and you're hungry, desperately hungry. Because the porridge at breakfast was burnt, not scorched, but black, with a taste that made your throat close, and you couldn't eat it, and there wasn't anything else. The next meal is dinner, hours away, and dinner will be the same rancid meat, the same thin potatoes, the same bread that's a day too old. You walk the 1.5 miles. You sit in the church pew. You listen to a sermon about sin, about the weakness of the flesh, about the dangers of worldly comfort. You listen to William Carus Wilson's theology, which he also published in a magazine for children called The Children's Friend, filled with stories of young sinners who died suddenly and went to hell. He believed in the instructive power of terror. He believed children needed to understand that death was close, that sin was closer, and that only obedience and suffering could save them. If you've ever been told that your suffering is good for you, you'll recognize what comes next. The girls at Cowan Bridge read these stories. They heard these sermons. They absorbed day after day the message that their natural impulses, hunger, warmth, comfort, rest, were spiritual weaknesses to be conquered. That the cold in the dormitory was a test of faith, that the bad food was a lesson in humility, that the pain of sitting through a 3-hour church service in wet clothes was, in some obscure but important way, good for the soul. And the discipline was relentless. Not physical beatings necessarily, though punishment was common enough. The discipline was in the atmosphere, in the constant surveillance, in the expectation of silent, unquestioning obedience, in the belief, communicated every day in every interaction, that these girls were inherently sinful and in need of correction. In July 1824, a clergyman named Patrick Brontë enrolled his 2 eldest daughters at Cowan Bridge. Maria was 10. Elizabeth was 9. They were followed in August by their sister Charlotte, who was 8, and in November by Emily, who was 6 years old. In a school where the food was rotten and the building was cold, and the man in charge believed that a child's discomfort was God's will. Maria, the eldest, was by all accounts an extraordinary child. She was clever, well-read, and gentle. She had a quality that people noticed, a quietness, an intelligence, a capacity for thought that seemed older than her years. Charlotte would later write about her with the tenderness that never faded. At Cowan Bridge, Maria became a target, not because she was disobedient, because she was ill. She arrived at the school already weakened, possibly already carrying the tuberculosis that would eventually kill her, and as she grew sicker, The teachers treated her not with care but with impatience. One incident, recorded in Charlotte's later account and corroborated by other former students, became a defining image of the school. Maria, too ill to dress herself quickly in the morning, was dragged from her bed by a teacher and punished for being late. She was sick, visibly, obviously sick, and instead of receiving care, she was punished for the inconvenience her illness caused. Charlotte watched this. She was 8 years old. She watched her older sister, the person she admired most in the world, being humiliated by an adult who should have been protecting her, and she never forgot it. There's something else you need to understand about Maria's illness, because the word tuberculosis can sound clinical and distant. It wasn't. Tuberculosis in a child is slow, visible and relentless. It begins with a cough, then the cough deepens. The child loses weight, not gradually but noticeably, week by week. Her face thins, her eyes grow larger in proportion. She tires easily. She can't keep up with the other girls. At night she sweats through her sheets. In the morning she's weaker than the day before. And all of this happens in a room full of other children. In a dormitory, in a schoolroom, the other girls see it. They hear the cough. They watch her grow thinner. They know what's happening, even if they don't have a name for it. And nobody removes her. Nobody sends her home. Nobody does anything until she's too ill to stay. Maria endured this at Cowan Bridge for months before she was finally sent home. In February 1825, Maria was sent home. She was dying. She arrived at the parsonage in Haworth weak, emaciated and beyond recovery. She died on the 6th of May, 1825. She was 11 years old. Imagine Patrick Brontë, her father, the clergyman who'd signed the fee book, who'd believed in the school, who trusted the man who ran it, opening the door of his parsonage and seeing his eldest daughter carried inside. The girl he'd sent away strong enough to travel was now unable to stand. The education he'd paid for had returned her to him in a box-shaped space between the bed and the wall, and she would not leave it again. Elizabeth was sent home a few weeks later. The same illness, the same decline. She died on the 15th of June 1825, two sisters, dead within 6 weeks of each other, after less than a year at a school their father had chosen because he trusted the man who ran it. Charlotte and Emily were removed from the school after Elizabeth's death. They survived, but Charlotte carried what she'd seen, and if you've ever witnessed something as a child that you couldn't process until years later, you'll understand what that carrying felt like. For the rest of her life, it shaped her, it haunted her, and 22 years later she turned it into fiction. In Jane Eyre, published in 1847, Charlotte Brontë created Lowood School, a thinly veiled portrait of Cowan Bridge. The character of Helen Burns, gentle, patient, wrongly punished, dying slowly of tuberculosis, was Maria. Charlotte gave her sister's story to the world, renamed but unmistakable. The cruel teacher, Miss Scatcherd, if you've read the novel you'll remember her, was based on a real teacher at Cowan Bridge. The burned porridge was real. The cold, the damp, the hunger, real. The typhus outbreak that swept through Lowood in the novel was based on a real epidemic that struck Cowan Bridge in 1825, sickening dozens of students and killing several. Charlotte wrote it all down, every detail, not as revenge, though there was anger in it, unmistakably, but as testimony. She had witnessed something, and she made sure the world would know. When the novel was published, William Carus Wilson was furious. He recognized himself in the character of Mr. Brocklehurst, the cold, hypocritical clergyman who ran Lowood. He denied the accusations. He published responses defending his school. He insisted the conditions had been acceptable, the discipline appropriate, the deaths regrettable, but not his fault. The public didn't believe him. Jane Eyre was one of the most widely read novels of the 19th century, and the picture it painted of Cowan Bridge, of a school that starved children, humiliated the sick, and hid behind religion to justify its cruelty, became the definitive portrait of everything that could go wrong in a boarding school with no oversight and no accountability. It's worth noting that Cowan Bridge wasn't a typical Regency boarding school. It was poorer than most. It served a different class. Its religious framework was harsher than what you'd find in a fashionable seminary in Bath or London. The schools that charged 40 guineas and taught harp and watercolours were not, in most cases, starving their students. But the underlying structure was the same. Private ownership, no regulation, no inspection, total authority over children who had no voice. The difference between Cowan Bridge and a prosperous school in Surrey wasn't one of kind, it was one of degree. And when the degree tipped far enough, children died. That's not a historical curiosity. That's a design flaw, built into the system from the beginning, invisible until someone paid the price, and then quietly covered over until the next time it happened. The girls who survived these outbreaks carried the memory with them. Charlotte Brontë carried hers into the most famous novel of the Victorian age. Others carried theirs into silence, into the quiet, private grief of a family that lost a daughter to a school that was supposed to give her a future. But there were other girls, and this is the part you should carry with you. Girls whose names we don't know. Girls who died of typhus at schools that left no records. Girls who coughed through the winter in dormitories where nobody thought to call a doctor. Girls who were buried in churchyards far from home, with a headstone paid for by a father who'd spent everything he had on fees and who received his daughter's body in return. There's no novel for them, no Helen Burns, no Jane Eyre, just a line in a parish register, a brief note in a school's accounts, and then silence. The system produced Maria Bronte's death, and it produced her sister's death, and it produced hundreds of deaths we'll never count. And after each one, the school closed for a day, or sent a letter, or held a service, and then opened again the next morning, because the fees were due, because the building was rented, because the headmistress had no other income, because the world outside hadn't stopped needing accomplished girls. And yet the schools continued. The advertisements kept appearing, the fee books kept being signed. Because the alternative, admitting that the system itself was broken, was something no one was ready to do. Which raises one final question. After the routine, the devices, the silence, the letters, and the disease, after all of it, what happened to these girls when they finally left? What did they become? And was any of it, in the end, worth what it cost? The answer depends on which girl you're asking about, because the system produced very different outcomes, and those differences had almost nothing to do with talent or character. They had to do with luck, with timing, with who your father knew and how much money was left after the fees were paid. For some girls, the system worked exactly as designed. They left school with enough polish to attract a suitable husband. They married. They moved into houses that were slightly larger than the ones they'd grown up in. They had children. They managed households. They played the piano after dinner and embroidered cushions that were admired by guests. They performed, in their marriages, in their drawing rooms, in their daily lives, the same accomplishments they'd learned in the schoolroom. The performance became permanent. It became them. For these women, The boarding school was a success. They'd been reshaped, and the new shape fit the mould the world had ready for them. Their parents' investment had paid off. The wager had landed. But even for the women who married, the successful ones, the story was more complicated than it looked from the outside. Marriage in Regency England was not a partnership in any sense you'd recognise today. Under the legal doctrine of coverture, a married woman's identity was absorbed into her husband's. Her property became his. Her legal rights vanished. She couldn't sign a contract. She couldn't sue or be sued. She couldn't even keep her own earnings if she had any. She became, in the eyes of the law, invisible, a legal non-person, covered by her husband like a garment covers the body. The accomplishments she'd learned at school, your accomplishments, if you'd been that girl, were useful in one direction only. They'd helped her attract a husband. Once the marriage was settled, those accomplishments became domestic decoration. She played the piano after dinner. She embroidered cushions for the parlour. She managed the household, supervised the servants, raised the children. And she did all of it inside a structure where her husband had total authority over her person, her property, and her children. If the marriage was kind, her life could be comfortable, even happy in the limited way that happiness was understood. If the marriage was unkind, if the husband was cruel or drunk or indifferent, she had almost no recourse. She couldn't leave. She couldn't take the children. She couldn't appeal to the courts without money and connections she almost certainly didn't have. The boarding school had prepared her perfectly for this. It had taught her to endure discomfort without complaint, to perform contentment regardless of what she felt, to sit still, to hold her tongue, to present at all times a pleasing surface. Every lesson in that cold schoolroom, every hour strapped to a backboard, every supervised letter home. All of it was preparation for exactly this kind of life. The school hadn't failed these women. It had succeeded terrifyingly at the task it was designed for. But for many others, perhaps the majority, the outcome was less neat. Some girls came home and didn't marry, not because they lacked accomplishments, but because, and you can probably see this coming, the market was crowded. There were more girls being polished than there were husbands willing to take them. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Not every girl who could play the piano and embroider and curtsy would find a drawing room that wanted her. Some families ran out of money for a proper dowry. Some girls' backgrounds, the shop, the trade, the father who worked with his hands, were discovered despite the polish. Some were simply unlucky. And for those women, the accomplishments they'd spent years learning were suddenly a different kind of burden. They knew how to play the piano, but nobody was asking them to play. They could embroider beautifully, but there was no one to admire the work. They could sit up perfectly straight, but the only room they sat in was their father's parlour, growing smaller around them with each passing year. The most common path for an unmarried, educated woman was to become a governess, and this is where the system reveals its cruelest irony, because a governess was the living proof that the system had failed. A governess taught in someone else's house. She lived in a room between the family's quarters and the servants. She ate alone, or with the children, but rarely at the family table. She was expected to be educated, refined, and accomplished. But she was also expected to be invisible. She occupied a social no man's land, too educated to be a servant, too poor to be a guest. She was the ghost in the machine, teaching the same accomplishments she'd once learned, to a new generation of girls who would learn them for the same purpose. The daily experience of being a governess was a slow, particular kind of humiliation. You woke in a room that wasn't yours, in a house that wasn't yours, to teach children who might or might not respect you. The mother of the household might treat you as a professional, or she might treat you as a slightly elevated servant. The father might ignore you completely. The children, especially the older ones, could be cruel because they understood your position even if they couldn't articulate it. You were the woman who was paid to be there. You had authority without power. You had education without status, and every day, in every lesson you taught, you were passing on the same system that had produced your own predicament. Teaching another girl to play the piano, teaching her to sit up straight, teaching her the accomplishments that might help her marry so she wouldn't end up like you. The circularity of it was devastating. All three Brontë sisters worked as governesses: Charlotte, Emily and Anne, the daughters of a clergyman who'd sent them to Cowan Bridge and Roe Head and various other schools. All entered the profession that was waiting for every boarding school graduate who didn't find a husband. Charlotte Brontë described the experience in her letters with controlled fury. She hated it. She hated being treated as something between a servant and a guest. She hated the loneliness. She hated the families who expected her to teach their children accomplishments, while treating her as though she barely existed. A private governess has no existence, she wrote. She is not considered as a living and rational being. Anne Brontë drew on her own experience as a governess in her novel Agnes Grey, a quieter book than Jane Eyre, but in some ways more devastating. Agnes Grey describes the daily humiliation of a woman who is educated, intelligent and capable, but who is treated as furniture by the family that employs her. The children are spoiled, the parents are indifferent, the governess is expected to produce results without authority, support or respect. That was the reward for years of boarding school, for the backboard and the needlework and the supervised letters and the cold water in the basin. You became the woman in the room nobody looked at. Some former students took a different path. They opened schools of their own. This was the one entrepreneurial option available to an educated woman, to take what the system had taught her and sell it to the next generation. Charlotte and Emily Brontë actually planned to do this. They travelled to Brussels in 1842 to study French and German at a school run by Monsieur and Madame Eyre, with the explicit goal of improving their qualifications so they could open a school in Hareworth. The plan never came to fruition, and if you're sensing a pattern by now, you should be. Charlotte fell in love with Monsieur Eyre, an attachment that was never reciprocated, and that caused her private anguish for years. Emily hated Brussels and returned home as soon as she could. The school they advertised received not a single application. Nobody wanted to send their daughter to a parsonage in a remote Yorkshire village, no matter how well the Brontë sisters could teach French. But other women did succeed. They opened small schools in rented houses. They placed advertisements in newspapers. They promised accomplishments and moral attention. They charged fees. And the cycle continued. Because what else was there? The system reproduced itself, not because it worked, but because nobody had invented anything better. The system did eventually change, and you might find some relief in this, slowly, unevenly, and over decades. By the 1840s and 1850s, reformers were beginning to argue that girls' education should include substance, not just surface. That women might benefit from learning mathematics, history, science, subjects that had been reserved for boys, that the accomplishment model was shallow, dishonest, and ultimately harmful. These arguments gained ground slowly. The reformers, and you should know their names because they deserve to be remembered, women like Frances Mary Buss and Dorothea Beale, who founded the North London Collegiate School and ran Cheltenham Ladies' College, didn't demolish the old system overnight. They chipped away at it. They proved that girls could learn Latin and algebra without becoming unmarriageable. They showed that education could be an end in itself, not just a strategy for the marriage market. By the end of the 19th century, the Regency boarding school was largely extinct. The accomplishment model had given way to something more structured, more honest, and, in most cases, less cruel. But the transformation took generations, and the women who lived through the old system, the ones you've been walking with tonight, never got to see a world built on different principles. And this is perhaps the most important thing to understand about these schools. They weren't designed to fail. They weren't designed by cruel people with bad intentions. They were designed by a society that had decided what women were for, and then built institutions to make that decision real. A woman was for marriage. Her education existed to make her marriageable. Her accomplishments existed to display her in a favourable light. Her body existed to be shaped into the correct posture. Her voice existed to say the correct things. Her letters existed to reassure the people who were paying for all of it. And when the system worked, when the girl married well and the family's position improved and the accomplishments served their purpose, everyone nodded and said the schools were doing their job. And when the system failed, when the girl didn't marry, or married poorly, or fell ill, or died, or spent the rest of her life teaching other girls the same empty skills in other people's houses, everyone looked away. Because looking at the failures would have meant questioning the system, and the system was all they had. Jane Austen looked at it, and if you love her novels, you owe something to the schools that sharpened her eye. From inside the system, as a girl who'd been through it, she saw what it was and described it with the precision of a watchmaker. She never married. She lived in her family's house her whole life. She became the greatest novelist of her age. And she did it not because of what the boarding schools taught her, but in spite of it. Charlotte Brontë looked at it, and if you've read Jane Eyre, you've looked at it with her, from the other side, the side of poverty, of loss, of sisters buried in a churchyard. She saw it and turned it into a novel that shook the conscience of an entire nation. Jane Eyre isn't just a love story, it's an indictment of the schools, of the system, of a world that treated children as raw material and called the manufacturing process education. These women, the ones who survived the system and then described it, gave us the only honest portraits we have. The schools didn't produce their own critics. The letters home were censored. The prospectuses were advertising. The truth came later, in fiction and memoir, from women who'd been shaped by the machine and then spent their lives trying to describe its gears. What the boarding schools of the Regency era actually produced in the end was something nobody intended. Not accomplished wives, not refined mothers, not polished drawing-room performers. They produced silence. Generation after generation of women who'd been taught to perform contentment, suppress discomfort, and never, under any circumstances, describe what was really happening to them. And that silence held for a very long time, until a few women, a few extraordinary women, broke it. So let's go back to the beginning, back to 1806, back to that room where you're 12 years old and sitting very still, with a steel rod pressed against your spine. You don't know, sitting there, that the system built around you is already carrying the seeds of its own exposure. You don't know that a girl at another school, a girl named Charlotte, a clergyman's daughter from Yorkshire, is watching her sister being dragged from a sickbed and is storing every detail for a book she'll write 2 decades later. You don't know that a woman named Jane, who sat in a schoolroom not unlike yours when she was 9, is already developing the quiet, devastating eye that will turn parlours and seminaries into literature. You don't know any of that. All you know is the ache, the steel against your vertebrae, the leather pulling at your shoulders, the sound of other girls breathing in the same room, each of them held in the same device, each of them learning the same lesson. Hold still. Be quiet. Don't show what you feel. And you're learning it. The lesson is working. In a few years you'll be able to sit perfectly still without the device. Your spine will hold itself straight, not because you want it to, but because the muscles have been trained day after day to remember the shape the school imposed on them. You'll play the piano. Not brilliantly, that was never the goal. You'll play well enough, pleasantly enough. You'll speak a little French. You'll embroider a cushion with careful, even stitches. You'll walk into a room as if you've always belonged there, and someone watching you from across a dinner table will see exactly what your parents paid for. A young woman of poise, of refinement, of quiet, pleasing accomplishment. They won't see the rod. They won't see the cold water in the basin. They won't see the letters you wrote home, full of gratitude you didn't feel. They won't see the girl who cried into a pillow at night silently, because crying aloud would be reported. They'll see the surface, the performance, the accomplishment, and they'll call it a success. The schools of Regency England didn't leave behind much physical evidence. Most of them were private houses rented and returned. The desks were moved out. The dormitories became bedrooms again. The backboards were put away or thrown away. No plaques mark the buildings. No museums preserved the harp that a 12-year-old played with aching wrists while someone across the room judged whether she was worth pursuing. What they left behind is quieter than that. They left behind a template, a way of thinking about girls' education that lasted long after the Regency ended. The idea that a girl's education should be measured not by what she knows, but by how she appears. Not by the strength of her mind, but by the smoothness of her performance. That idea didn't die in 1830. It didn't die in 1850 or 1900 or 1950. It's still here, in different clothes, with different names, in different schools, but recognizable if you know what to look for. The steel rod is gone, but the expectation of performing a self that isn't quite real, of sitting up straight, smiling when you're tired, saying I'm fine when you're not, that hasn't gone anywhere. Every woman listening to this tonight knows exactly what that feels like. The boarding schools of the Regency era didn't invent it, but they refined it. They systematized it. They turned it into a curriculum, and the girls who went through that curriculum, the ones who survived it and the ones who didn't, deserve to be remembered. Not as footnotes in a chapter about Regency manners, not as background characters in someone else's novel, as people. Young, real, specific people who were cold and lonely and far from home and doing the best they could with what the world had given them. They were not accomplished. They were brave. They just weren't allowed to show it. If you're still here, and I think you are because you're the kind of person who stays until the end, I want to leave you with one last thought. The next time you read Jane Austen, pay attention to the schools. They're there, in the background, mentioned casually, treated as ordinary. Mrs. Goddard's school in Emma, the unnamed schools that shaped the Bennet sisters' accomplishments in Pride and Prejudice, the whole architecture of polite society that Austen describes with such precision, the music, the drawing, the careful conversation, the dancing, all of it was built in rooms like the ones we've been walking through tonight. And the next time you read Jane Eyre, remember that Lowood isn't fiction. Not really. It's a memoir wearing a novel's clothes. Every burned piece of porridge, every cold dormitory, every cruel teacher, Charlotte Brontë didn't imagine those things. She remembered them, and she wrote them down so that we would remember them too. These stories matter, not because they're dramatic, though they are, not because they're shocking, though they can be. They matter because they're about children, real children, in real rooms in a real country not very long ago. Children who were cold and hungry and lonely and brave, and who had no way to tell anyone what was happening to them. We can hear them now. 200 years later, through the letters they wrote and the novels they published and the memoirs they left behind, we can hear them now, and that's worth staying up for. Tonight we walk through the schools that shaped them, the market that created the demand, the women who ran the supply, the daily routines that ground the hours into submission, the devices that shaped the body, the letters that shaped the silence, the diseases that broke through every defence, and the futures, bright or dim or heartbreaking, that waited on the other side. It's a lot to carry, and you've been patient with it. So let this be the last thing. Rest now. Let the schoolroom empty. Let the candles go out. Let the girls finally leave the building. They've been sitting still for a long time. The fire in the schoolroom has burned down to embers. The last candle is guttering in the hallway. The dormitory is quiet. The girls are sleeping, or pretending to sleep, or staring at the ceiling the way children do when they're too tired to cry and too awake to rest. Somewhere in that room, one of them is thinking about tomorrow. Another one is thinking about home. Another one is composing a letter in her head. A letter she'll never write because it would say things that aren't allowed. Let them rest. Good night.